Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Microsoft Azure, shifting the data center, or in a lot of people's cases, server room or rooms. It was quite difficult to try and choose a title for this event, given various people are in different phases of their data center journey. So it's trying to understand and trying to capture who this audience or title would best suit. So this is the fifth in the webinar series. We've got one more to do on automation next week, which will be starting at 10 a.m. around Power Automate and Power Apps. And we're going to give you real world scenarios as to how the platform can enable automation and efficiency within the 365 product set. So hopefully see you there for that one. Today's event is specifically on Microsoft Azure. And we're going to try and dispel a lot of the myths or dark arts in pricing Azure, what it's used for, how costly it could be or can be, and what are the typical challenges organizations face and the drivers to utilize a public cloud tool set. We're very much focusing on Microsoft Azure. That isn't to say there aren't other public cloud providers out there, such as AWS or G Cloud, or even private data centers or shared hosting infrastructures. But we're continuing on the theme of a Microsoft platform and how it all centralizes around one product set. And that is the Microsoft platform. So we will cover off all those things that I mentioned today and also give you some demonstrations on how to price this up and how to migrate your first workloads into Microsoft Azure. So my name is Mark Alford. I'm the Cloud Solutions Architect for Circle IT, and I've been with the organization for 13 plus years. I've come from a technical and management background. So I've hopefully got a bit of a blend of both worlds and not just acting from a architectural point of view, but understand how this operates in a real world environment. And for Circle IT, we are a 17-year-old organization with 80 plus staff. We focus primarily on as a value-added reseller, and we offer services around not just cloud and cloud services, but also managed support, hardware, so server, storage, networking, virtualization, those types of services as well. But underpinning all of that as well, we have a strong managed services arm, which we support a number of clients in various different sectors, as shown on screen there. So let's dive straight into it then. So from a Microsoft Azure standpoint, first of all, what is it? So Microsoft Azure is a public cloud service. It's a combination of data centers spread geographically across the globe, utilizing very large scale enterprise technologies to be able to deliver public cloud services to you, the end users, to utilize as best you need. And the Microsoft Azure platform, if you're already coming from an Office 365 environment, will already give you a step above utilizing other cloud services providers, purely because it will all be predicated on your single identity to start with. And by default, you will have an Azure tenancy, because the underpinning identities that I've just referred to will be hosted in Azure Active Directory, which is the service that underpins Office 365. So what this allows you to do is to leverage not just the global capacity, but also local capacities within the data centers. And for the UK specifically, there are 2 data centers presently, one in UK South and one in UK West. So if you do have data sovereignty requirements, you do have the ability to retain that data within one location, which is the UK. So why would you move your infrastructure to the cloud? Given that a lot of people typically throw around, well, how much does it cost? It can be quite difficult to manage. How does this work? So for the typical first move that we see is for scale. And to try and put that into some sort of perspective for you, all of Microsoft services are clearly based on the Microsoft Azure platform. And Teams, the environment that we're using today, scaled up 12 million users in 7 days. Now, that's not to say that all of the organizations participating in today's live event will need to have that type of scale, but it allows you to introduce additional scale and capacity to your infrastructure. And moving on to the second point around economics, you only pay for what you use within that environment. So you're not having to purchase a substantial amount of equipment, hardware, or services from providers to be able to facilitate potentially a short-term project. And a use case that we've seen in some places for this is where a university or an educational establishment will come to us and say, we actually need 50 terabytes of additional data for a 6-month project. In a physical world where your infrastructure is still on premise in your own data center, you would usually have to go to a vendor, source the equipment, go through the whole procurement process, maybe that's a tender or something else to make sure that you're getting value for money. And you are then having to procure that kit, set it up into your data center, and then eventually get that out to the people that need to use it. With Azure, that disappears. You can turn on and add as much or as little storage as you need for that given time. And once it's finished, you can spin that back down. Again, only paying for the services at that time that you're using it. Now, clearly from an agility point of view, what I just described in terms of the traditional buying cycle disappears. You have the ability to just add this at any given time. It's kind of like a tap. You just turn it on and you've got as much or as little as you need. What that also allows you to do is, as you scale your operations or potentially need to spin up additional infrastructure in other locations, that allows you to move the infrastructure services or software services or platform services closer to where the end users need them to be. So if you have a factory abroad, maybe in Eastern Europe or in China or some other far country, you have the ability to share the infrastructure resources across multiple different regions to make the user experience a lot better for them. And given the role that I'm doing at the moment as a cloud solutions architect, these are the typical popular questions that we get asked. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you'll be able to play this back at your convenience afterwards. For a lot of these questions typically spawn around the unknowns, because Azure is somebody else's data center. So is it secure? And the answer quite simply is yes. Microsoft have a global team of security experts managing and monitoring the Azure infrastructure for a start. And comparing that to your typical setup within organizations, particularly in an SME environment, you're not going to have the same amount of resources or budget in order to be able to adopt the same security practices that Microsoft are. Similarly, will Azure really save me money? I keep talking about the money aspect of it at the moment, but that's one of the largest barriers that we have to overcome when we're trying to understand people's drivers for moving to the cloud. And it can genuinely save money with various options on the table for you on how to deliver services. And we'll talk about the migration and how that works very shortly. So what are some of the drivers for this? There are an awful lot of different drivers, whether that's for a particular project, so for the urgent capacity needs, or you already have a data center contract with a provider, and that's coming up for renewal, or you're just at a precipice where your hardware is coming up for refresh. These are just some typical drivers, and depending on where you're at on that life cycle, determines how quickly you need to assess your infrastructure and the capability and compatibility of a public cloud service provider, and how you get it to there. And we'll talk about in detail the different types of migrations that we can undertake very shortly. But one of the other key drivers that we look at is a compliance driver, which might sound very boring for a lot of people, but it's a very real position that we have to be in, is how do you make sure that your data center environments, your server rooms, your data access and control conforms to the compliance and regulatory requirements that you have as an organization. So how do you prove to people that you are securing the environment as best possible? How do you show them that your data center or your server room conforms to the relevant standards? And more importantly, how does it conform to a lot of the industry standards that we're now working towards is all around environmental friendliness and things like that as well. So how does your data center and your carbon footprint comply to what you need to as an organization? So we touched upon some of the drivers just now, and storage is one that just exponentially increases year on year. Every organization continues to add data into their environment. And within your current infrastructures, if it's still on premises, that is, will have a finite amount of capacity before you reach a point where you need to purchase additional storage. Similarly, you'll also have challenges around backup and disaster recovery. If you're on premises at the moment, what you will have is a secondary location potentially, or a service that is being offered to you that will have a finite amount of resource on there again, in order for you to be able to back up and do DR tests and do your disaster recovery, which leads on to how quickly can you actually perform a DR test, or how often do you perform and test those, because the infrastructure that you would have procured to be able to do those may not have enough capacity for you to run the DR tests. And it also leads on to unmanaged complexity and limited IT agility. Again, you've got typically finite amount of resources to be able to play with in an on-premise or data center world where it's co-location. So some of the use cases that you can consider as part of a storage opportunity is to understand how Microsoft Azure can be leveraged to help on that transformation and move into a public cloud. So there are hybrid cloud storage tiering options that you can look at. So that is where you've got your existing infrastructure on premises, and you can introduce the options to add additional storage into the cloud, which then enables you to do things like big data and analytics, as well as cloud sharing. But it also allows you to move your backup and disaster recovery elements into Azure. Now, what we see in a lot of instances around this is where people are using Azure as their backup and disaster recovery, it also aids to their cloud migration at a future timeline. So if you are utilizing Azure Site Recovery for your backup and disaster recovery option, which is a native tool set for Microsoft Azure, that will mean that your data is replicated from your on-premise environment into Azure. So your cloud journey is technically done at that point. Yes, there are a lot of nuances that we need to consider as part of it, but your cloud journey, your infrastructure, your data is then in Microsoft Azure. So in order to turn that on, in the event of a disaster, you flip the switch and your infrastructure is lit up in public cloud, and your end users and client services will be pointed to a different direction, and you would start to consume the services in Azure. So the most common use cases are backup and archive to the cloud, disaster recovery to the cloud, and then test and dev. So those are quite easy ones for you to look at as a starting point to move some of these services into Microsoft Azure without having significant impact to your daily operations within your organizations. So what are the first steps? So you can quite easily prepare your environment and understand the implications of it at no additional cost should you be prepared to do this work, obviously within your own organizations. There are tool sets available at each stage provided by Microsoft that allow you to do the initial assessment at the pre-migration stage. During the migration, there's also tool sets in there, and that's where you can use Azure Site Recovery to do that seamless migration into Microsoft Azure. And then you have your post-migration, which is your cost management. Because clearly, once you've moved your infrastructure into Microsoft Azure, the flip of having a finite amount of resource that you know how much you spent 2 or 3 years ago on that hardware, it's not going to cost you anything more, is that Azure is on a pay-as-you-go basis for some of the services, although you can do options to reserve it and have a predictable cost month on month. But you want to make sure that you are providing cost management services for the organization to understand where the costs are, and similarly, repurpose those costs if you're consuming too much performance for something that isn't utilized. So these are built-in tools that Microsoft provides you that you can run yourselves, or you can engage third parties such as ourselves in order to help deliver this initial assessment. So the Azure migration journey, I'm trying not to use that word too much during today's presentation, but there's kind of 2 ways that this gets tackled. There's the top-down buy-in, which is providing your business case, you get your exec sponsorship and your business and IT alignment. So that is very much your vision strategy from an organizational point of view to migrate services into Microsoft Azure or a public cloud environment to give you the agility, the economies of scale, as well as the cost savings that you're looking at. The other one is the foundational investment. So if there's a very big step change within your organization, i.e. your hardware or data center contracts are up for renewal, the natural evolution for a lot of organizations at the moment is to consider public cloud or have a cloud first strategy, which means then you need to invest in the technical pieces to get there, the process and the people, because traditional infrastructure management goes out of the window when you move to something like Microsoft Azure, because Microsoft are the ones that are managing the infrastructure for you. So it's then around how you educate the people that utilize those services, as well as your processes, to adapt to a cloud first environment. And to do that, we need to assess the existing environment. We then look at the migration options and migrate services into public cloud. And once that's done, we then look at optimizing the services within that environment. And that adds to continual optimization as well. So that isn't a one-time trigger. Once you've done the migration, this is a continual piece of work when we look at the optimization. So as part of that migration journey, the migrate stage has various different options within there. And some of these are predicated on how much time that you have in order to get to a public cloud environment. So once you've done the initial assessment, if you're short on time, then you would typically look at the rehosting option, which is a lift and shift. You can also refactor some of those services within there as well to look at delivering SQL Server as a Azure SQL instance. So it's using platform as a service as opposed to SQL sitting on top of a virtual machine. That offers better cost savings. Or you look at the bottom 2, which is re-architecting and rebuilding, so that you take your legacy applications or services and build them into cloud native applications. So you take advantage of the services that's available within Microsoft Azure, whether that's big data or you're using CosmoDB or something along those lines, or containers, to be able to take advantage of cloud native delivery. That is where you start seeing massive amount of return on investment compared to what the traditional infrastructure services would produce. So to summarize some of the architectural methods that we've got in here, it's kind of just summarizing what I've said just now really, and some of the drivers on there. So for rehosting, yes, you would do that at a point in time to get there, which ultimately turns into infrastructure as a service. Your refactoring is platforms as a service, and your re-architecture and rebuild is your software as a service, your PaaS, and your microservices. So the latter ones are more so for applications than anything else. and the earlier ones in this diagram are predominantly your traditional infrastructure and platform as a service. So when we come to looking at the migration strategy, this is a brief table we've put together to give you some guidelines as to how you go about deciding which migration strategy to achieve. And it also gives you the primary technology that underpins it. So if you are a short to medium term, if you're a short-term migration candidate, then you would look at the rehosting of the majority of your services. Now, by that, if you look at this in quite simplistic terms, if you've got 10 virtual machines on site at the moment, you would rehost all of those virtual machines in Microsoft Azure. You'd obviously take into consideration the client server applications and understand the performance impact for this, but you could quite quickly take those virtual machines and migrate those virtual machines into Microsoft Azure, and they would run as though they were running previously. There'd be no change to the end user, nothing would really be any of note, except you've now got rid of the servers that you would have had in your server room or data center. That's what rehosting is. It just moves them from one location to another. Refactoring takes into consideration, out of those 10 servers, you may have had 2 of those as SQL servers, so now you're running 8 virtual machines in Microsoft Azure, and 2 of those virtual machines have been converted into SQL as a service. So those are the types of kind of realizations of where you are, and re-architecture and rebuilding would only realistically be done in a longer term environment, as it requires a fair bit of upfront work to re-architect and rebuild those applications in order to take advantage of cloud native services. So one of the areas I'm going to cover off now is how do we price Microsoft Azure? And a lot of people ask us questions continually around how does this work for organizations that need to procure this through various different methods. And quite simply, I'm going to share with you the pricing calculator that all organizations will have to use in order to price Microsoft services. So what you'll see here is a publicly available pricing calculator. And currently this one is blank. Now, you can engage us to do the pricing, or in order for you to establish some budgets and things like that, just to understand what this looks like, you can also have a look at this and see how much things cost. So if I were to create a very simple infrastructure, this pricing calculator gives me some suggestions right up front on what the featured services are. So I can add these and they will appear in my list in the bottom, which essentially builds out a shopping cart of services I want to procure. So if I needed to run a virtual machine, I also wanted to add some storage on here. I would need to add my VPN gateway. I also need some bandwidth. And I also want to add some disaster recovery capability. So quite simply, those are the ones that I want to add. You'll see there's cost management and billing on here as well, but that comes by default within the tenancy that you create. But for this purpose, I'll add it just to show you what that looks like. And I'll also add an Azure SQL database. So all of these items now have been added within my shopping cart. So you can see the virtual machine, storage accounts, VPN, bandwidth, Azure Site Recovery. So prior to this stage, we would have done an assessment to understand which items would be moving to the public cloud. But let's just expand these out and show you how fairly straightforward it is to create this. So if I call that test price, we're going to call this virtual machine standard virtual machine. Now we have the option to select in the region. So for this purpose, I'm going to select UK West, but you can see all of the regions that are available to you across the globe. So we select UK West. We then have the option to do the operating system. And Microsoft Azure isn't specifically for Microsoft services. It can introduce any open source environment into its capability as well. So please don't think of this as a closed off Microsoft-centric ecosystem. So the type of server I want, yes, I only want the operating system. The tier that I want for this purpose is standard. I'm not going to bore you with the basic and low priority on this. But then I have a pretty long list of types of configuration that I need to select. Now, for a server that is going to be hosting one kind of application or client server application, I would have done the assessment prior, and it's told me that I need a D4v3, which consists of 4 CPUs and 16 gig of RAM. And I only want one of those virtual machines. And I can also select how many hours I want to run it for. Now, I'll change my pricing to Great British Pounds, considering that would probably be more applicable to everyone else. And go back up to this virtual machine. So this virtual machine is telling me at the moment it's going to cost £226 a month to run. Now that is on the pay-as-you-go option. You now have a few different options to select from in order to decrease that price. So if you know that server is going to be fairly static, and as an organization you don't plan to increase your user base significantly or decrease it, and you don't think that you're going to need to make a change to that virtual machine once it's in use, you can select the 1-year reserved option, which will give you up to 65% discount, or the 3-year reserved option. Now this will dynamically change the price as you select them. So quite easily, you can see it's gone from £226 to £180 by reserving it for a year. And you can also decrease it further from £180 to £154 a month by doing it on 3-year reserved instance. And you can either pay that upfront or you have the monthly options to pay for that. If you're on certain enterprise agreements with Microsoft or with another third party, you also have the option of bringing your own license as well. So by default, all of these will include the Microsoft license, but the Azure hybrid benefit means that it decreases the cost even further because you've already paid for the license. So you can see it quite drastically changes that price. So it's quite a key thing to note as part of pricing any solution. But for this purpose, I'll leave the license. You've also got the options to add managed disks in here as well. So I will add a managed disk, and all that means is that Microsoft will manage that disk for you, so you don't have to play around with it once it's configured. And that cost is £3.94 on top of that virtual machine running. So from a storage accounts point of view, I'm just going to quickly select UK West. I'm not going to go too much detail on these. We do have the option then for the redundancy purposes of doing local redundant storage, zone redundant or global, and what type of capacity that is. So if I just want to add 1 terabyte of disks onto this, 1-year reserved instance for the disk, because I'm pay as you go because it's always going to change. The VPN gateway, UK West, 730 hours because it's going to be on full time. And then the bandwidth. So bandwidth, you only pay for egress data. Egress data means the data coming out of Azure, not what you put into it. So on average, I'm going to say that I need 1 terabyte of data coming out of Microsoft Azure. I want to back up this one virtual machine into UK South, so the opposite location. And I need 1 of those as well. And cost management and billing, as you've seen there, there's no charge for managing Azure spend, so that's all fine. And the Azure SQL database that I need within here as well is a single database. I'm going to select some default options here just to show you what that looks like. because SQL can be quite expensive, as everyone knows. So the SQL cost is £1,263 per month. But again, if I put 1 year reserved instance on that, that brings it down quite a bit. So the monthly cost in totality is £716 with an estimated upfront cost of £6,457, as we've selected some of the options on this to pay upfront for some of these services. So what we can do here is change various options, and hopefully you can see how quickly it is to price up some of those environments. And that is a very basic environment. And if I were to remove the SQL database element of it, just to run this one virtual machine in Microsoft Azure with backup and the terabyte of storage, it's £277 per month. So that gives you an indicative idea of how cheaply these services can be created within the Azure environment. And again, I would encourage any person on this live event today to create an Azure environment, set up a tenancy, have a play with some of these services and see how quickly it is to set them up. So I'm just going to switch back to the presentation a second, and I'm going to give you a brief demonstration now of how simple it is to create these environments within Microsoft Azure. And again, the reason for that is a lot of the issues that we encounter when we're talking about Microsoft Azure is, well, okay, it's all well and good that these services are available, but it's quite difficult and tricky for us to set these up, or we haven't got a tenancy. So I've created a very quick tenant this morning. So this is created within our profile, so you can see that I'm currently logged in up here, and this is the main page I get when I log in. Everything with Microsoft Azure is linked to a subscription. So after this, we can provide you with a subscription for your existing tenancy with £125 worth of free credits, so you can try some of these services out, which based on the previous pricing, you'll be able to see that you'll probably be able to run a virtual machine and have a play around with it for a minimum of kind of 15 days on that, so you can see what this looks like. And then you can spin it back down afterwards. But within Microsoft Azure, I'm going to demonstrate how we create some pretty basic services. So from within the creating a resource, there's a marketplace. So if anybody's familiar with an Apple device or Android, they've all got app stores. Think of this as the app store for Microsoft Azure. Some things will already have predefined services already built. Some of them will just allow you to build your own. And they're categorized into various different areas. So what I'm going to do is show you Windows Server creation and a WordPress site, showing you the platform as a service and infrastructure as a service elements and how quickly they can be created. So for a Windows Server 2016 data center, that allows us to create this from templates. It also has quick starts and tutorials. From a migration point of view, and your first steps into getting services into Microsoft Azure, you need to establish your connection to your tenancy in a secure way. And to do that, you would set up a site-to-site VPN connection between Microsoft Azure and your on-premise firewall, or whatever other connection that you've got in play. Now, to do that, you would add initially your virtual network gateway, which I had one here earlier in true artifact style, and this test gateway would be forming the VPN back to your on-premise environment. Now, what you can see from within here, this is clearly a test one that I've created earlier, but you can see any statistics on ingress and egress data for the past hour, 6 hours, 30 days. You can also see the connections that are specific with this and the configuration. So what you'll hopefully see from this is that there's no code needed to be able to create this VPN gateway. There's no complexities in terms of that. Yes, you need the fundamental understanding of how networks and gateways work, but this is all web driven. There isn't a need to have people diving into Cisco code or anything else that may be needed for this. So the very first thing you do is create your VPN gateway to Microsoft Azure. Once that's done, you've got a secure connection to utilizing the services within Microsoft Azure. So if you now wanted to spin up a virtual server to utilize some of these services within Microsoft Azure, we can create a resource. And that resource I want to create now is a Server 2016 build. And again, all of this at the moment is taking into consideration a web page and give me a graphical user interface. It doesn't matter what device you're on, whether it's Mac OS, Linux, Windows. As long as it's an HTML5 browser, you're good to crack on with it. So every resource that you create is linked to a subscription, as I mentioned earlier. That subscription can be containerized so that only certain people have access to it, or certain admin accounts, so that you're not having to give everybody within the organization full control or the ability to manage resources within a live environment, for example. You may only want to give them access to a dev and test subscription, which you can have multiple subscriptions for. Then I want to select where I want to put this resource. And it's always good practice to have resource groups for the specific activities or services that you're creating. So I'm going to set my pre-sales MA group, and I'm going to call this test VM. I'm going to pop that into US Central because for this demo, it makes absolutely no difference where I put it. I've then got the option to create availability sets, which means that if this virtual machine is absolutely critical, I would want to put some availability options in there, which means that that VM will always be available regardless of if a region within Microsoft went down. I'm then going to use an image, and these are all pre-populated images that are within Microsoft Azure that you can select. And again, there are Linux options within here as well as Windows. So I'm just going to select Windows 2016 Data Center. And this is where I'm going to change the size to where I suggested it would be earlier. I'm just going to select D3 V2. And it's as simple as that to change it. And it gives you your estimate of what that is likely to cost you on a per month basis. So I'm going to call this circle test and give it a username and password. Now for this very first step, I've got the option to allow the public inbound ports. And I can select RDP, SSH, HTTP, and so on. Obviously, by allowing RDP connections to it, it's going to enable that to be accessible to the outside world. So clearly, you need to make sure that your security is in play beforehand. I'm not going to make any changes to any of the others, but we can create amendments to the disks, the networking, the management, and the advanced, and create tags and everything else. But given that we've got a short amount of time to demonstrate this, I'm just going to carry on and create the virtual machine and let that carry on. So that's as simple as it is to create a new virtual machine based on Server 2016. And that deployment is now underway. Give that 5 minutes or so and it will be done. If I go back into Home and say, for example, I wanted to set up a website for a specific instance within my Azure environment, I'm going to set up a very quick WordPress example for you to see what this looks like. So quite quickly, all I've done is search in the marketplace for WordPress, and I'm going to create this service based, so it's now creating an application for me based on the service that I've selected. I'm also going to add it to the subscription I created earlier, which is my demonstration one. I'm going to add it to my existing resource group as opposed to creating a new one. and then I have options to select in my database provider. So I'm going to select Azure Database for SQL, and I can change all these other settings in here as well. And give it a username and password. And once that's done, I can create that resource. And as you would have noticed, hopefully up in the top right-hand corner, I also had a notification to say that my Windows virtual machine had been created successfully. I can now go to that resource and see that this is operational. And this is my management for the Microsoft Azure virtual machine. So I can see that the status is running. I can see that where the location of that virtual machine is, what subscription is applied to, what operating system, the size, the public IP address, and the private IP address as well. And then this is the metrics that I get to see the performance of that virtual machine, and a whole load of other settings and operations and monitoring that I can do down the left-hand side. But I'm not going to go into that today because this is how you get your services into Azure and demonstrating how quickly these things can be set up. If I wanted to connect to that virtual machine, I click connect. So I'll change the method of my screen presentation in a second to share the whole screen. Fantastic. So if I connect to this one now and select RDP, I can download the RDP file and connect to that RDP instance. Accept certificate. And that is now me into the virtual machine that I've set up as a server in that environment within the space of 5 minutes. So this hopefully demonstrates the agility that you've now got at your capability. Yes, you will have the same agility on an on-premise infrastructure, providing you have the amount of capacity that you need. But that lends itself back to the initial capacity conversation as to how much you need to spec up your infrastructure for. This changes the dynamic of that conversation when you're only paying for what you need to pay for at any given time. So this machine is now operational. I can do whatever I need to with it, and it's pretty much a virtual machine that is available for me to manage within this console. And you can start to see some metrics that have been pulled through, obviously, where I'm now connected to it. I can now stop that virtual machine, and that will mean that that virtual machine now will be turned off, and you will not incur any more costs for that virtual machine, except for storage costs. So you're not paying for your computer memory or network utilization on there now. It's just the underlying storage that you would have, or that you will be charged for based on the capacity of that virtual machine. So that is a very quick demonstration of how these services can be quickly enabled within your environment and to add additional capacity to it. The use cases that I mentioned earlier around storage, you have the ability to add various different items within this. So if we looked at the options for storage within here, we can add a storage account allocated to the same resource group. And give it a unique name. We can select whether we want it the standard, the premium performance, cool or hot. And once again, we can quite quickly select, review and create, and away it goes. And then you can allocate as much storage as you need to within that environment. What we've now successfully deployed as well is the WordPress site. So just slightly over 5 minutes within this environment. So you can see the deployment is complete. We'll give you some status on there. So if I go into my resource group where that information was deployed, these are all of the items that I've created. So these are all the different components that have been created as a result of me doing the initial virtual machine creation. So again, I'm not having to go and create holes on the firewall. I'm not having to create additional LUNs on the SAN in order to be able to manage this. This is all done when I've created that service. So the virtual machine that I did earlier, it created me a public IP address, created me a public security group, or a network security group, sorry, a network interface, virtual network gateways were there earlier. For the WordPress element, it's created me an app service plan, an Azure database. I haven't had to go and do any of that. I've just gone to the marketplace, selected WordPress, and go. So if I now go into the Circle Test WordPress site, this gives me my insights again to that information, but the URL that it's given me, which is publicly available, is this. And this will now take me through to my WordPress site, or my newly created WordPress site, which will allow me to make the amendments and configuration changes that I would like to for that particular service. And in true demonstration style, it's taken a little bit longer than I'd anticipate. There we go. So that is now my WordPress installation completed, and I'm now able to configure WordPress to what I need to. So that is up and operational and working from day one. And again, that is just something that it hopefully gives you an idea of some of these services that are there, but they are services being added daily to various categories that we mentioned within here. And you've got the ability to take advantage of, once you're consuming these services, all of the options that you've got within AI and machine learning, for example. So if you wanted to do things around facial recognition, computer vision, so if you work on a production line and you wanted to start to do some Q&A, you can teach the computer vision the versions of the right information within that QC control process of where it needs to be and what does good look like. And it will highlight anomalies to you then based on the information that it sees. You can also introduce web apps and bots within this as well. So if you have customers or users of your services that you have commonly asked questions that you have predefined answers for, you can utilize the web app and bot services within this. And all of these have got quick links and tutorials on as well on how to use them. So this isn't as though Azure is just selling you a service and then letting you to get on with it yourself. This is very much providing you with a how-to guide on these services and what you can do to get them up and operational. So hopefully that's given you an insight into the Azure world and what that looks like. And very much so from an Azure perspective, it is very capable service, particularly given where we have been over the previous few weeks and the capacity requirements of these services like Azure has been heavily utilized, not only just from Microsoft perspective, but obviously customers delivering services within the Azure platform. So once you've started to consume some of that information or services within Azure and put your information in there, some of the key areas for us to then look at is a continual improvement cycle around that platform. The security foundation should really be looked at right from day one and make sure that you've got yourselves off to the right footing. Once you've got the security in place, that isn't a be-all and end-all. That needs to be continually reviewed. And there are various features within the Azure platform that allow you to do things like just-in-time administration, which means that your general admin accounts by default don't have admin capability. They have to be given an elevated privilege to be able to manage that environment which means that people can't delete resources and the likes. So it actually lends itself to a more robust security platform. But throughout all of this, then you need to make sure that you're protecting your services. So the governance that comes with backup of DR, because this is an easier system to make resources live and utilize the platform that's available, you need to make sure that you've got a policy in place which comes back to your people area as well on how you make sure all these services are protected. If you add a new service, how are you backing it up? Does it need to be replicated across to another region? Does it need to be highly available? All those things need to still be factored in as it would be on an on-premise environment. The monitoring capabilities within Azure is quite feature rich. I would say probably in one thing to this is trying to understand how you bring all those into a centralized management platform. And Azure can allow you to create your own dashboards, but you may already have tool sets in play that allows you to monitor all of your infrastructure services in one pane of glass. So there are still abilities for third-party tool sets to link into the APIs that Microsoft provide. And with the items that I've shown you today, such as creating a virtual machine very quickly, all of these can be scripted as well for automation purposes. And when we talk about cost saving in this type of environment, if you have a traditional Citrix or remote desktop environment that you want to move to Microsoft Azure to leverage on that benefit, you can quite easily turn your machine off every night. Or if you've got a farm of 10 remote desktop servers, you could turn 8 of those off every night, which means you're not paying for the compute and processing power that would typically be associated with those. So you can quite easily turn that down. So just a quick call to action for everyone on this now. So what we're doing as part of this is to hopefully encourage everyone to get to grips and utilize Microsoft Azure. We are offering £125 free credit to anybody that reaches out to us. We can provide that via subscription, which means you can go and do some testing. We're happy to kind of get that tenancy set up for you as well. In order to do that, either reach out to me personally if you've got my contact details, or go to circleit.co.uk/feedback form. But then similarly, you can also price up your own solution to give you an idea of what this looks like. And there are endless amount of resources on there on the Azure website which help understand the migration journey that you need to go through as part of this. But should you not have the capability or the inclination to be to want to do this for yourselves, we do have some packages available for you to be able to kind of call upon our expertise when we've delivered this. And these start from £2,500 in order for us to be able to provide you with a comprehensive report on the compatibility, the plan, the migration, the approach, covering the different areas that we've put in these slides here. So if that's of interest, use the same contact methods as I mentioned earlier in order to reach out to us. But there are different ways of looking at these assessments. Some of you will be in different positions to others, quite clearly in terms of short-term migration or whether it's a longer-term vision for the organization to aspire to, and they have different approaches. So please reach out to us should these be of interest. Following on from the themes that we've done on the other webinars as well, we can also provide remote workshops, which are a lot more in depth than this webinar, but they are on various different topics all around the Microsoft platforms and tool sets. So again, if any of those are of interest, or if you have a requirement for anything that isn't listed, please feel free to reach out to us via circleit.co.uk/feedback-form, or drop me an email at mark.alford@circleit.co.uk. So we've got one more pre-planned event next week around Power Automate and Power Apps, where there will be full of demonstrations as opposed to a load of slides, where we will be kind of giving you an understanding of how to eliminate paper-based forms and bring in automation and efficiency to your organization. So I'm just going to review a couple of the questions that we may have had now whilst I've been presenting. I'm just going to publish that one so everyone else can see that in a second. So the question is, surely rehosting VMs in terms of performance to end users is primarily dependent on investment in connectivity and might not retain the same performance level. In general, how do costs scale from a well-maintained and updated in-house server room to full Azure? So there's a couple of questions in there, I think. So for performance for end users, yes, absolutely. It's primarily dependent on the investment in connectivity. So there's a couple of pieces to that. Should the infrastructure that is in use have a lot of client-server applications? And those client-server applications are resource or bandwidth intensive. So for example, if it's a by legacy line of business application, I mean something that isn't necessarily delivered or built for the cloud. That means that if you perform a query or a simple search within that application, it might pull back 100 megs worth of results. That is clearly going to have an impact if you move that workload into Microsoft Azure. And there's two ways of combating that. Either there's a significant connectivity increase required or cost required to be able to deliver that, depending on what you've got now. Or you re-architect the application to not do that. Or you actually move the workload and the client's workload as well, so that all the processing is done from within Microsoft Azure. And that can take advantage of something like Windows Virtual Desktop or Remote Desktop or Citrix Online, for example, which essentially means that you're moving the workload as close as possible to the underlying data that it needs to reference or to service. So that changes the dynamic, and that's where the longer term strategy comes into play around how your applications and your users service the data and their operational requirements, which is where the initial assessment piece is a prerequisite before moving workloads into Microsoft Azure. But what we are seeing with the advantages of software as a service-based applications is most application providers now have a software as a service-based offering. And if they don't have that, it will be there shortly in most instances. And to answer the second question, in general, how do costs scale from a well-maintained and updated in-house server room to full Azure? Unfortunately, that's on a case-by-case basis. That isn't it's a 20% type of saving type response because various people will have different ways of architecting the infrastructure that they've utilized. If they combine it in conjunction with a full Office 365 deployment or Microsoft 365 deployment and leveraging SharePoint services, Teams, telephony, and consolidating a lot of the large data outlays that they would typically have in a file share and things like that into utilizing the software services they're already paying for, then it has a different dynamic again. So that is quite a difficult one just to put a percentage on it or cost saving. I think in terms of the general note on pricing for Azure is feel free to contact us so we can do an initial assessment and give you some indicative pricing on what that could be. Even if it's ballpark figures, we can kind of provide information on what that could cost to run in Azure. So I appreciate everyone's time today once again. Look forward to seeing you all again next week at the slightly earlier time of 10 a.m. Thank you very much.